the title of the project, and the people at the Northern Rocky Mountain Science Center that are involved at this stage. I'd like to thank the Climate Science Center for funding this project. It was a call for proposals that went out specifically to USGS science centers, and because of the interest in sage-grouse, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in terms of the LTCs, we chose to put this project together, and so far we're pretty happy that we're getting rolling, but it's just getting rolling. I know, Catherine, that you're following along and not on the web. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. Sorry, I've got you on mute.
That's okay. I'll just try to keep describing the slides so that you can make sure that you're in sync with what I'm showing. This is a slide that sort of says partners and people I've contacted. The idea behind this slide is to, even though we recognize that this project is just getting started, we've had a lot of contact with a lot of folks.
Hey, Rick, and I don't think we've seen the partner list come up yet.
This is Mike Larson. I've got it up.
Okay, there it is. And by the way, Rick, I should ask you, would you like people to ask questions as you go, or do you want them to hold that thought till the end?
Either way, I guess we've got a small enough group here that we can certainly deal with questions along the way. If they're more discussion-oriented, maybe it'd be good to wait till the end so that we can sort of get everybody involved in the discussion. But if you've got some specific things you need clarified, feel free to chime in. Yeah, that's for sure.
All right.
In any case, we've just gotten started, and the project got rolling a little bit with some discussions we had with folks from the Fish and Wildlife Service at Charles M. Russell National Wildlife Refuge and with BLM field offices in Montana. And obviously, USGS is supposed to be the science arm of Interior for those agencies, and that's sort of where we got started in relation to the project. There are a couple, my color blindness doesn't let me recall what color I chose, but you see Mike Riley, Liz Shanahan, and Linda Vance's names here are different colors than the abreast. Those three folks are actually funded through our project, the contract through USGS, to do some specific work, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, but I wanted to let you know why I've highlighted those in a different color. I wasn't going to talk very much about the inter-LCC collaboration plan for the Greater Sage-Grouse that Greg Watson and potentially Steve Torbett later will talk to us about. Our project specifically is what I want to talk about today is this North Central Climate Science Center project. But I want to point out that it fits in real closely with this inter-LCC collaboration project. And what we're trying to do is trying to sort of provide some spatial data as well as a framework for thinking about adaptive management. And I think as we talk later and have a discussion about this inter-LCC collaboration effort that's funded by the Fish and Wildlife Service, hopefully we'll see where the two sort of fit together as one being part of the other. What you'll see come up next is a map that you're probably all familiar with that's a current and former distribution, historic distribution of sage-grouse in North America. And the point of this slide is just to reiterate how important the Plains and Prairie Potholes LCC is to the conservation of greater sage-grouse in North America. I think, before you actually sort of see it spatially like this, it doesn't really hit a person in terms of how important the Plains and Prairie Potholes LCC is to that portion of that aspect of sage-grouse management. So I serve as one of the science coordinators, along with Sean Fenn, for the Great Northern LCC. And one of the projects that we've done is gone through and have done an analysis of the state wildlife action plans across the Great Northern and identified those species of greatest conservation need as they're identified in the swaps, and looked at it for commonalities across the states in the Great Northern, and one of the species that comes out clearly as important to the Great Northern is the Greater Sage-Grouse. And it's not just about species, it's about their habitats and ecosystems and about ecosystem processes, which is sort of the point of this slide here, is to recognize that even though we're sort of species focused at times, for good reason, because we can begin to monitor species sometimes more easily than we can their habitats. But in any case, the idea here, the point here is that the Great Northern had identified sage steppe habitats and greater sage-grouse as being important. I think the Plains and Prairie Pothole LCC not being quite as mature in their development yet as the Great Northern, because the Great Northern was one of the first ones out of the blocks years ago. Haven't maybe gotten to this point, or maybe they won't. I think that's clear. I think from what I've visited with Mike and with Rick Nelson, that obviously sage-grouse and sage habitats are important to the Plains and Prairie Pothole LCC, and I guess that's something for the LCC team to discuss further and to see where they want to take it. But it seems to me that it's pretty obvious that these two LCCs that we share some common resources in sage steppe habitats and in greater sage-grouse. The important part of this slide is not so much the details here. It's something that Tom Olaf put together, one of our co-coordinators for the Great Northern. But his point of all this was not the details, but rather this thing on the bottom left there that says paradigm shift. We talked for years about prescribed fire, maintaining and promoting natural vegetation, and now maybe we got to think about prescribed fires promoting invasive cheatgrass, and probably having a negative effect on a lot of sage steppe habitats. That's not to say that fire is always bad, but it's really changed, I think, our paradigm, particularly as we go south and west in the Great Northern LCC. But I think it's something we need to be thinking about across. Anyway, the whole idea of this is that we need to think about these habitats differently than we have in the past, not about the details here that are potentially presented. The next slide is one that you probably have all seen as well. It describes the management zones for the greater sage-grouse in North America. And obviously, if you look at management zone 1, which is sort of overlies a good portion of the Plains and Prairie Potholes, you see that dark area in sort of north central Montana, northeastern Montana, sort of focused north and south of Fort Peck Reservoir, where the numbers of greater sage-grouse are the highest. We think that's important as a place to focus, and that's sort of what our partners initially were talking about. And recently, as we've begun to ask Montana, particularly Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, about helping us think this through and getting them involved as we've sort of got out of the starting blocks just a tiny bit. I think it's important for us to have that discussion about where our focus ought to be and why it ought to be there. But I think in a general kind of sense, from the LCC's perspective, what we see is this is a species that's broadly distributed across the landscape, and in fact, this area of north central, northeastern Montana is a key area for greater sage-grouse. A number of questions we can ask about climate and sage-grouse. I'm going to go through some of those now. What are the essential habitat parameters, sort of ecological minimums, if you will, sort of now and under future climate scenarios? That's sort of like climate envelope modeling to some degree. Number two, habitat parameters are likely to persist in the next 30 to 100 years, given the possible climate change scenarios. We know that for Wyoming big sage, that part of Montana where has the highest number of sage-grouse right now is expected to be one of the cores from which that particular sagebrush will tend to potentially move north and east from there. So we know it's an important area from a sage steppe habitat as well. Number three should be coming up here. What are the climate-related habitat parameters for sage-grouse? For example, the weather conditions at peak of hatch and winter depth. And going to talk more about this in a little bit, so I'm going to skip over it now and go to number 4 and talk about, mention how well are key sage-grouse relevant climate parameters and phenomena represented in global and downscaled models. I think that we spend an awful lot of time in the climate change world talking about making better and better global and downscaled models. It's important to bring forward in our discussions here. I don't think it's necessarily the key question we need to be talking about, but I raise it as one of these climate interactions. Number 5, is there a relationship with the recent historic climate record in highly functional or degraded habitat areas or population densities? Number 6, we start talking and thinking about genetic diversity and genetic connectivity and what's the influence of future change. The Great Northern LCC has funded a genetics project. I think that Greg Watson was a key person in ensuring that the kind of work got rolling this year in connection with our partners in Montana. But thinking about genetic diversity and understanding some of that for the Greater Sage-Grouse across its range and how climate change might impact genetic diversity in the future. As in a former life, grad school-wise and earlier, back in the 70s, I spent some time working with pheasants in Iowa, in northwestern Iowa in particular. And one of the things that is sort of a truism in a lot of upland game bird management is that climate, weather conditions in particular, at peak of hatch, really drive sort of annual numbers, particularly fall numbers for most upland game birds, and sage-grouse are probably no different in that regard. Winter mortality in relation to snow depth for sage-grouse is probably pretty important in central northeastern Montana, and we think that those are probably some weather parameters that might be affected by climate change in the future, and we need to be thinking about those. What would happen if, sort of a risk analysis, what would happen if there were a number of years where we had wet, cold conditions at peak of hatch in a row, or maybe even in combination with heavy winters? Would we expect to see a decreased number of sage-grouse? How recoverable is it from that if we have good weather? All those kinds of scenarios are pretty important, I think, to think about from a climate perspective. As we talk a little bit more about the inter-LCC projects, and grab a little more depth later, I think one of the things that we're trying to do in our project is to begin to have adaptive management and how it might be helpful to be thinking about sage-grouse management activities, be it on BLM land or Fish and Wildlife Service land or anybody's land for that matter, and how we might think about that. And as we're all aware, we have to delineate the suite of management alternatives that are out there and the decisions that are being made. Obviously, there's an important need to set some sort of objectives in some fashion for some portion that you're interested in. You have to implement some sort of management mantra that responds. I think it's really key that we think about evaluating using models, because that sort of begins to help quantify some of the thought, some of the logic involved in terms of what's happening in terms of the management, and we'll talk more about that in a second. As part of our project, in that idea of identifying decisions and the suite of management alternatives that are out there for managers, we've contracted with some human dimension scientists at MSU, both in the political science department and the business college, to assess that suite of management decisions that are available to biologists and their partners out there, to try to gain insights on how those decisions are made, and as well as to consider sort of the local ranchers and other stakeholders' interests and how they're sort of considered as well. And we're in the process of getting those contracts with the folks at MSU, and they'll be contacting managers out there, sort of independent of the rest of us, to try to get an unbiased view of how those decisions, what decisions the folks in the field really think that they are able to make, and how they're making those decisions, so that as we put together decision support tools and start thinking about adaptive management that we're not, that were in fact, let me say it differently, not in a negative but in a positive, so that we're in fact addressing those specific kind of management decisions that are being made. And because we're interested and because this particular project is being funded by the North Central Climate Science Center, we want to look for those sage-grouse management decisions that particularly have a nexus with climate data and climate change. One of our key partners is NOAA and their North Central Climate Pilot Project, and we want to have the human dimensions folks, as they're interviewing and as they're talking to people out in the field, and think a little bit about climate data and climate change and their activities. One morning, I was sitting on my deck having a cup of coffee and going through and reading the 2005 Montana Management Plan for sage-grouse. And as part of our project, I began to realize if we're going to think about this in a truly adaptive management framework, we do have to have some sort of model by which we can sort of think about how all this fits together and use it for some evaluative kind of purposes. And so I began to think about it in terms of trying to come up with a conceptual model of fall populations of sage-grouse and sort of the things that the management plan identified as important to grouse, and began to put that together with my idea of thinking about this as a Bayesian belief network. We don't need to really go into the details of that right now, but the idea is that you have sort of these causal relationships involved, and the real important part is understanding the conditional probability tables that underlie those kind of causal relationships. And of course, that's where the rubber meets the road, and I don't claim that we know that all those, we have enough data to actually do those, but we can use expert opinion in a lot of these cases to build these kinds of models. That's sort of what we're proposing to do, and we think that the inter-LCC collaboration is a good way of not only doing it for this site in this area, but also maybe thinking about it in other areas as well. I underlie the fact that this is draft. This is something I did put together pretty quickly. And a couple folks that have looked at it, one of the things that comes to mind right away is the fact that we haven't included West Nile virus in some of this, and there's some other management actions as well. But just wanted to present this in terms of the kind of thinking that we need to present in terms of the conceptual model to be thinking about adaptive management, not that this is the final model. I have another project that I was able to get funded in collaboration with our work from the North Central Climate Science Center with a computer scientist professor at Montana State University by the name of John Shepard. And John's specialty is artificial intelligence and using Bayesian methods. He's already begun to put this into a Bayesian belief network, and we'll be working with him to try to see if we can begin to make this useful to managers as we proceed down the line. The point of this slide is to show that grouse are moving across the landscape, that in fact greater sage-grouse are in fact a species that is a landscape species that's involved with landscape conservation. I don't know that we have all the details and knowledge of what exactly that means, but some of the work that's been funded by Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks to the University of Montana, I think probably BLM has been involved, and maybe the refuge as well, Charlie Russell Refuge, that basically have shown that these birds that are nesting in southern Canada are moving clear down, even across the reservoir, and wintering on parts of CMR. It shows that we've got to be thinking about landscape conservation when it comes to greater sage-grouse. If they're not, a bobwhite quail or a ringneck pheasant that are staying within a small home range, but rather they're using the landscape pretty actively. And I don't know that this particular map depicts any kind of accuracy of how they're using that landscape, but they're obviously using it. We need to be thinking about that as we're thinking about landscape conservation for grouse. One of the key members of our team here at Northern Rocky Mountain Science Center is a statistician by the name of Kathy Irvin, who some of you may have worked with. And she's particularly interested in trying to connect the data that's been collected at sort of disparate spatial and temporal scales, and particularly with sage steppe habitat, and how that sort of can come together. And one of the things that she'll be working with our partners, with you all and others, is how can we make that be useful in terms of thinking about how we monitor sage steppe habitats in particular across the range of the Greater Sage-Grouse. As a result of that kind of thinking, in one of the workshops that she held here about almost 2 years ago now, not quite, in Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks, Montana Natural Heritage, Park Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, a whole bunch of folks were involved, Forest Service, biologists, basic inventory and monitoring types, were proposed that one of the things that was really needed, particularly throughout Montana, but particularly in northern Montana, was some sort of sage steppe habitat map. And so we're using a bunch of the money from this particular project that we've gotten funded to essentially do a habitat map, sage steppe habitat map, using spot imagery centered on CMR. We originally decided that we were going to use the 7 spot images that you see in black, outlined in black here, and recently it has been suggested by some of our partners that maybe we shouldn't focus as much on a couple of the eastern spot images and maybe work on those 2 northwestern spot images that you see outlined in red. And so we're in the process of rethinking exactly what area will be covered by this particular new map. But late this summer and early fall, the Montana Natural Heritage Program, particularly Linda Vance and her crew of technicians, will be out collecting data and then providing a map of detailed image analysis for sage steppe habitat mapping for this part of the world. And part of the idea, of course, is to give the managers in this particular area specific data that they can use. But the other idea is to think about this as a potential way of mapping larger and larger portions of the Greater Sage-Grouse habitat. In the Great Basin and parts of the Wyoming Landscape Conservation Initiative lands, there has been a fair amount of work done on detailed mapping of sage habitats in those areas. When we get into the northern part of the sage-grouse, we find that there's less and less, almost no really good habitat maps, and we're trying to see if we can develop some methodologies for rectifying that. If you look at what we're trying to do also is we're trying to help managers understand sort of climate 101, as some of the climate folks here, Greg Peterson in particular, a climatologist that works for our center, will be talking. We're going to have mentioned this a little bit later. We're going to have a workshop probably in Lewistown the first week in December to talk about a lot of this whole project and to talk about how we should move forward in terms of adaptive management and other things. But the key point of this is that we really want to begin to listen and hear what some of the ideas of climate data can be useful to managers in this part of the world. The next slide says anticipated deliverables. I guess you can read through those. I mentioned the workshop that we're going to have. Well, part of that workshop report will incorporate the information about how decisions are being made and with the interviews prior to the workshop. We'll make those kind of things available, obviously, on our websites and whatnot. We do plan to report on sort of a recommended adaptive management framework, and hopefully that'll be something that will come out of this workshop, and as well as some other discussions, and basically address some of the transboundary management decisions that are being discussed. It doesn't necessarily mean international transboundary management decisions all the time. It might mean private-public transboundary. It might mean Fish and Wildlife Service BLM transboundary. It might mean DNRC transboundary. It's just a lot of those kind of things across jurisdictions as well as habitats. Obviously, we'll be using LCMAP as a key way of providing the data that we're going to be providing and developing. The sage-steppe habitat map is another deliverable. And also this idea of Kathy talking about providing statistical analysis for sage step monitoring across district scales is another key aspect, so that for those folks that are interested in using Kathy's expertise, it'll certainly be made available. The next slide shows Joanne Dullum when she was still at CMR, and it says we hope to be able to connect a wide array of partners from across the management agencies that are concerned with sage-grouse with new partners in the North Central Climate Pilot Project, as well as the North Central Climate Science Center. And the whole idea behind that is to bring the managers and the scientists together and thinking about decisions, trying to pull that conceptual model that includes climate information, think about monitoring and evaluation, how that should be done, as well as providing some of this base habitat data layer so that it might be helpful for sage-grouse. My concluding slide shows some prairie with a rainbow sort of ending up on what I think is some flax in the background, and it sure would be great, I guess, if that rainbow was pointing out some real nice sage steppe habitats, of course, in regard to sage-grouse habitat. Although our work, because of the way it's funded, is thinking about an awful lot about climate data and climate change, we recognize that there are a lot of things that are affecting sage-grouse that are probably more important, at least in the short term, maybe even in the long term, than climate, including things like, as you're all aware, the importance of green side up, what the agricultural policies mean, energy policies and energy development across the landscape. All those kind of things are probably really important to sage-grouse management. And we're not trying to make light of or suggest that those things are less important than climate change, and quite the contrary. But like all things these days, and when we're talking about management, ecological management, we need to be thinking about sort of a multivariate picture, and how climate fits into it, how energy fits into it, how ag policies fit into it. As we well know, it's a very complex picture out there. But hopefully, at the end of the day, the birds will benefit, and that's what we're trying to pursue.
Okay, thanks, Rick. That's a great oversight of the project. I think we should just open it up for questions that anybody on our tech team may have of the work that's proposed, or any suggestions or insights you want to offer to Rick.
Rick, this is Dan Stringen in North Dakota. You pointed out that there was a sagebrush steppe map that you'd be working on, that there was a lack of such a product for northern Montana. I think that's absolutely correct, and there's a number of reasons for that. One is almost philosophical, how thick is a line, and another is just practical with the technology that's available to us. How well can we differentiate the smaller big sagebrush that's characteristic of the eastern fringe, as well as the natural, much lower canopy density? How are you guys defining sagebrush steppe?
I'm going to have to sort of punt on that question a little bit because I don't know the details, but I do know that when Montana Natural Heritage Program, they sort of have a protocol in place, and Kathy Irvin can send that to you, or I can get that to you, Dan. But the idea is not just to look at sort of the canopy, but rather can we identify sort of the full representation of what sage steppe habitat means, in addition to just the sage canopy itself. I don't know that we're going to be successful, but we're sure as hell going to give it a try.
I think it's an important effort.
Well, and Rick, I'm going to hold you to your commitment there to track down the specifics and get back to us with whatever you find out.
You bet.
Other questions for Rick? Do you know, you said your first workshop is going to be scheduled sometime in early December. Do you have specifics about that, or would you let us know when that stuff starts to come together?
Of course. most recently, our discussions with folks in Fish and Wildlife Service and BLM, we decided that we would hold it the first week in December. We haven't checked with folks in Lewistown at the two hotels there to see if we can host it there yet, and so there's some logistic issues, but that's certainly when we're hoping to hold it, and we're hoping to hold it in Lewistown. But yeah, you'll definitely be some of the first to know as soon as we get any more details about that.
Rick, this is Catherine. When you were talking about the work that Kathy Urban is planning to do and kind of pulling together the monitoring data that's available, who are your current partners on that, or are you going to be coming to agencies looking for data in the future for that?
This stems from the workshop that she held here in Bozeman, and Rick Northrup from Fish, Wildlife, and Parks was there. There were some folks from the Park Service in Western Washington, or Eastern Washington and Oregon that were there. Folks from the northern region of the Forest Service. A whole bunch of people that are all interested in sage steppe were there, and I know that they're continuing those discussions, and so we just need to talk to Kathy and find out sort of what the next step is in terms of what people are asking her as a result of that workshop. Sort of a bit incumbent upon those folks that were at that workshop to sort of follow up with her, but by the same token, I think that she is very interested in trying to see which people are interested in sharing what data. Catherine, there's a fella that's a retired Fish, Wildlife, and Parks person that's been doing some work in the archives of the library here at MSU too. I can't remember his name. I know that she's been in touch with as well.
Mike Christina?
Yes.
Just something that I would ask that you and your collaborators on this project to keep in mind is that Fish, Wildlife, and Parks here has a process for any research project that we're considered collaborators on, and my understanding is that would extend to data sharing in this kind of situation. So we would ask that a proposal be submitted to us, and our managers would review it, and we would move forward then at that point as being collaborators. So just wanted to make sure that you guys were aware of that process that we have, so that if you are going to be looking for that kind of participation from us on any of these elements, we're going to need to go through those steps.
Sure, and I think that probably is not atypical for all the agencies in terms of they wanting to ensure that all of this is beneficial to them, and that's of course what we're after as well. I think as Greg Watson later talks about sort of this inter-LCC activity as well, we'll begin to think about how the states through the Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies are going to be collaborating on sage-grouse and some other things as well. So it becomes really imperative to engage in those kinds of discussions, Catherine. You're right on.
Hey, Greg, I don't know if there was a smoother transition into your comments or if Steve joined you, but maybe you can go ahead and start the discussion on that unless there's some more questions for Rick. All right, Greg, you still with us?
Yeah.
Did Steve ever join you?
No, I think Steve's still tied up on another issue, so I'll just try to do a quick introduction of this inter-LCC collaboration effort. It's kind of fortunate that you've had a chance to listen to some of Rick's conversation and discussion, because essentially you can almost look at what Rick has just described more as a microcosm of this larger effort. In essence, most of you are probably aware that the Fish and Wildlife Service earmarked some funds earlier this fiscal year to facilitate large landscape scale cross-LCC collaboration for conservation planning and design. And the Mountain Prairie region of the Fish and Wildlife Service, in collaboration with 4 of the LCCs across the range of the Greater Sage-Grouse, essentially developed a proposal to pursue some of those funds in support of this inter-LCC collaboration effort. In essence, our proposal is to really add value to the existing conservation planning and research efforts by providing a unified information platform and increasing science capacity to the conservation planning effort. As most of you are probably also aware, WAFWA, the Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, was an early advocate of better integration of sage-grouse conservation actions across jurisdictional boundaries. And, some significant progress has been made, but there's still, I think, some examples of current redundancy as well as many data sources and analytical capability still being widely dispersed. So, in essence, this proposal that we put together and was funded for the first year of sort of a 3-year effort really has 4 main elements. First, being able to prioritize unmet sage-grouse information and management needs that are impeding effective conservation across the range of the species. Secondly, by providing additional funding for science support to address unmet needs through the partnerships of the LCCs. Next, adapting, supporting, and maintaining a management, planning, research, and data information portal, which most of you know as LCMAP at this time, to provide a unified site to access narrative, quantitative, geospatial, and habitat condition data and information available for the benefit of the larger sage-grouse conservation community. And sort of as Rick alluded to earlier, but again at a broader context, being able to provide some forecasting capabilities to spatially represent future habitat condition scenarios under change conditions across the range of the species. Just recently, we've been in conversations and presentations to the directors at the national or the WAFWA meeting in Hawaii to sort of begin discussions in this concept, and we're currently continuing those discussions with the idea from process base that we'd be looking to WAFWA and the technical committee to really identify not only sort of the status, distribution, and access to extant data sources, but also to identify some key science needs that could be addressed possibly over the next 2 to 3 years that would not only assist WAFWA in its conservation planning, but it would also contribute to the mandated services decision on the status of the species by 2015. Once those key science needs and data sets were in essence identified, we would be looking to the LCCs to essentially respond in terms of their ability to address especially some of those key science needs, at which time we could be able to disperse funds throughout the LCCs to essentially satisfy those. And essentially, in essence, be able to bring those data, both extant and novel, from these research efforts into this common data portal environment that would be accessible by across the community. Farther down the road, again, under the auspices of the LCCs, be able to use the accessibility to these data sets to essentially help have the management community within and across the LCCs begin to define some key decision support tools that they would like to have developed through utilization and application of these data for the conservation not only of the species but also across the shrub-steppe ecosystem. That's a real quick presentation of this effort that is just getting underway. Wanted to make everyone available or aware of that, and I guess I also asked Rick as a colleague and essentially putting together this concept if he'd like to add anything to this quick presentation of what I've just provided to you.
I guess the thing I'd add, Greg, is that obviously the sage-grouse community has had a lot of collaboratives and cooperatives and such together, and we're not trying to reinvent the wheel in that respect, but rather we recognize that the sage-grouse spans these LCCs, and hopefully the because the LCCs are turning out to be, I think, a pretty good combination of state and federal partnerships, that will be able to help with that kind of landscape perspective for sage-grouse, so that if we're thinking about adaptive management, we're not just thinking about it at one particular postage stamp, but rather we're thinking about what we can learn for the good of the larger range of the species.
Hey, Greg, this is Mike Olson. While I appreciate some of this might take a couple of years to get specific about what the needs are, I think we've heard at least a couple of times already today about the value of a data layer relative to the vegetation class. What would take 2 years to start working on something like that?
Nothing at all, Mike. Basically, in terms of access to expand data, I mean, that can be literally done within the next couple of months, especially using the capabilities that we've been able to develop through the LCC or the LCMAP geodata portal. In terms of collection of novel data to add value or to fill any data gaps in, respective to, say, vegetation assemblages, again, if that is identified through our collaboration with WAFA as a key need, in terms of, essentially collecting the data, digitization of the data, and even some field validation of those data could indeed take a year or two to essentially put that into place.
And that goes back to what Catherine mentioned earlier, is in terms of trying to have that discussion with the state Fish and Wildlife departments in terms of what they perceive a lot of those habitat layer needs to be, so that we can really work on it together.
Yeah, exactly. And in fact, that's one of the I guess reasons that we have advocated the use of LCMAP in this process, and that is, Rick, you might even expand on this, is because of the security that's available within that. Once essentially data sharing agreements are put in place, if you will, the keeper of the data has the ability to designate and identify the user community to which those data would be accessible. And then, of course, once that user community is identified, LCMAP also provides them with the ability to essentially collaborate virtually and develop data interrogation and novel outputs through multiple algorithms that again can be presented. Again, I just want to clarify that LCMAP is not a repository. It is essentially a virtual data portal in which the service and under this effort would not be going to our partners and asking them to essentially provide data across the board that would be stored someplace else, again in an effort to minimize redundancy, but to also provide a capability for one-stop shopping. We feel that LCMAP would be a phenomenal tool for utilization by the community.
Other questions for Greg or Rick before we wrap up here?
Greg, this is Catherine in Montana. Certainly this potential mapping that we're talking about would be something that we would support, but we're curious whether some of the additional money that you said would be available for funding support, would those be dollars that would stay within the LCC or within the USGS, or would those be available to all the partners to compete for?
Basically, the way this proposal has been put together and approved is essentially funds would be dispersed to the LCCs to collect or access these key data sets or pursue near-term scientific pursuits. Now, it's LCCs do have the ability, again, to work within their partnership community to disperse funds to satisfy, if you will, satisfy those researcher data requirements. So I guess you need to look at it as sort of a two-step process.
And putting on my LCC hat for a moment, from the Great Northern, one of the things that we would clearly support is trying to find a collaboration like we have now in terms of, is it Montana Natural Heritage? If you're putting together that kind of work, and if so, should we contract with them? I think we need to have that discussion, Catherine, in terms of what's the best way of moving forward with some of that. But I think that from understanding that both the LCCs as well as this particular inter-LCC effort are going to be looking for these kinds of projects that in fact have multiple partners together, working together.
And this is Mike. I'll just echo what Rick said from the Plains and Prairie pothole perspective. If there's a way for us to identify some capacity across the partnership that already has the ability to collect some of this information, that's a much better way, I think, to go about distribution of these funds versus a yellow come RFP. Obviously, we're going to have some of that, but hopefully we can streamline the process here in our out years.
Catherine, I guess the other part is that the intent is not for the money to stay within the Fish and Wildlife Service and USGS unless that's the appropriate place that the partnership thinks it ought to be. If that's the best place for the work to be done, that's another story. But the idea is for the partnership to consider where the best place for the work to be done it should be.
Okay, thanks. That was really helpful.
All right, well, I want to thank Rick and Greg for giving us an update. Obviously, the North Central Climate Science Center is an important new institution in our understanding of climate change and its impact across these two LCCs that we heard from today, Great Northern and Plains and Prairie Potholes. And this is but one of four projects that were just recently funded, Max is being another one of the four. So thanks again, Rick, for providing the update, and for Greg for giving us some background on this new cross-LCC sage-grouse effort. And just a heads up, I think our monthly meeting for September, which will be the first week of September, we're going to hear from the state of South Dakota in their updated State Wildlife Action Plan, in particular some of their emphasis that they've highlighted in this go-round. So that'll be next month for those on the tech committee. With that, any last words or comments from folks on the phone?
Dan, you mentioned wanting some more information. Can you send me an email at Sodja, S-O-J-D-A, at usgs.gov so that I can respond to you so I don't have your email? That'd be great.
Absolutely.
And the last thing, just real quick, Mike, I'd like to mention that Jeff Morris, that was on leave on vacation with his family and wasn't able to make it on behalf of the North Central Climate Science Center, but he really appreciates being able to collaborate with you guys.
Yep. All right. Thanks, folks. We'll talk again next month. And don't forget about the two webinars for the workshop that Max mentioned at the start of this call on the 13th and 27th, 10 o'clock Central Time. Thanks. Bye.